Without our involvement, changes happen without our consent.
Anti-Black racism in urban planning is a continuous and ongoing process. Although modern planning bodies and officials have acknowledged the history of discriminatory and harmful planning decisions, Black people continue to be excluded from participatory city building and consultation processes.
Black people have been excluded from the civic engagement of deciding how land is used in quite a number of ways. From a historical sense, there have been discussions around that only homeowners should be able to vote, that only homeowners should have the ability to decide whether or not a development in the neighborhood should be approved or not. In Toronto, being a homeowner was an incredibly important way to have access to being a part of a discussion. The people who are most likely to engage in planning processes are people who have wealth and are established. So it's typically wealthy white homeowners. In fact, the City of Toronto released a report some years ago that stated that the average person engaging in a community planning consultation is a white, wealthy homeowner over the age of 55, even though this is not the demographic who is most in need of our government services of community planning.
Things tend to move ahead based on the opinions and perspectives of those who are either loudest or who are able to participate, whether it's because they understand the process or they have accessible means to be engaged. Accessibility is a key factor, and I don't mean just in terms of persons with disabilities. That's a big one, but I also mean in terms of how many or what the opportunities for participation look like. So are we creating enough opportunities for people to participate?
The right to be heard and involved in city building was a privilege typically not afforded to Black Canadians, and the lack of consultation has resulted in negative impacts on the Black community and their ability to voice their concerns.
So when we think about anti-Black racism in city building, there's a couple ways we can think about it. One is the fact that Black experiences, Black culture, the lives of Black folks tend to be ignored or undervalued when people do planning processes. The other block is many well-meaning progressive folks have thought that by talking about issues Black people face, you reinforce stereotypes about Black folks. And so there was a whole generation of people in government who said we can never talk about race because we need to protect these people from racism. And the way to do that is pretending that race doesn't exist. And there was good intent behind that, but what it meant is the issues Black folks were talking about, whether it was over-policing, whether it was streaming in schools, whether it was issues of poverty, were ignored and lost because people weren't collecting the data. They weren't having open conversations.
This also makes it incredibly difficult to dismantle the racist ideologies that have been baked into our systems and to meaningfully acknowledge our history with racism.
Canada has this ability to really frame itself as being, the softer, neutral, kinder, gentler neighbor to the United States. And so there's sometimes no room for the conversations around the policy-oriented forms of racism that have occurred.
We have this Canadian mythology that racism isn't an issue here, that we always look at ourselves in relative comparison to the United States, and people say, well, we didn't have slavery in Canada, which of course we did, but just for a couple decades less. But in people's minds, we didn't have it here. We didn't have, Jim Crow or segregation, even though we had de facto segregation in communities. We can look at incarceration rates for young Black men and Black women in this country. We can look at issues of racial profiling, police brutality. Basically, we see very similar patterns, not the exact same as the United States. The degree and the magnitude might be less in some cases here, but we have this Canadian illusion that things are so much worse in the US, and so people should be grateful to just be in this multicultural tapestry of Canada. And Canada's a great place. We do pretty well on these issues, but that's in comparison to a global scale where people of African descent are marginalized, discriminated against, over-policed all over the world. So we may do it a little less here than in other places, but it doesn't mean it isn't an issue. But for people to come to terms with that, it means smashing some of these myths we tell ourselves about our country and how successful integration and multiculturalism has been in here. And I think that's the biggest cultural block.
The lack of consultation and acknowledgement surrounding the issues Black Canadians face is also extremely concerning in a landscape of real estate capitalism that has often neglected and disposed of these communities. At its core, real estate capitalism aims to reap the benefits of access to the valuable land these communities live on by extracting as much value from it as possible, even if that comes at the cost of the existing community itself.
There's a sense that there's no plan for us to remain where we are long term. The minute we become interesting in the real estate sense, we're at risk because we've been set up to be removable. We've been set up to be displaced.
Case example that's in the news right now, the Eglinton Crosstown, this really vital piece of infrastructure built in the city that went straight through Little Jamaica, one of the more established Black communities, Black business districts in the city. And there wasn't even a thought of what the impact would be, that this is an important part of our cultural fabric that needed to be protected. It was just, no, we're going to build this. And it seemed like maybe 8 or 9 years into the process, the institutional powers realized, oh, actually, Black neighborhoods matter. This place is actually important. We actually need to think about the impact.
It was a very well-known fact that investing in transit would lead to property values going up. Unfortunately, our government has not invested in planning for affordable housing to be built. The city completed their Eglinton Connect study in 2014, and you'd be hard-pressed to find the word affordability or affordable in that report. So in return for billions of dollars in transit investment, Black and marginalized communities who are renting have been displaced from their neighborhoods.
As we know, when you add new infrastructure, when you add a subway line, when you add a new community center, the property value of residences nearby increase. The incentive for landlords is increase the rent. For those homes that are for sale, the real estate agents are going to put the listing prices up because there's new amenities. That makes sense. That's how the market works. But what that means is the people who've lived in these neighborhoods when they didn't have the good stuff now are finding themselves priced out of their communities right at the time where all of these great investments come in. And so we have this perverse piece where we look at communities, we pour public investments in, but the people who need it the most are now pushed out and moved to another part of the city that doesn't have the investment. And so we keep pushing people to the fringes or till they leave the city entirely. And then what we get is middle class, upper middle class people enjoy these neighborhoods, which were traditionally working class communities.
That becomes concerning for the communities who historically have lived there and enjoyed these things, but now, they're of the interest of the capitalist machine. So what happens to the folks who have very little protection from that machine?
There have been so many changes in our community, especially with developments like the LRT. One, I can even say for many years, I've watched, and I'm not the only witness to this, but when you're taking the Eglinton West bus, the 32 bus, up or down, you'll see just a lot of closed doors, closed signs, for lease signs, for sale signs. A lot of businesses are pushed out of the community, and that's one of the things we advocate for as a community group, as a residents group, is to keep our culture through our businesses here. Without economic development, we don't have the jobs to put food on our tables and to keep a roof over our head. But we are advocating as a community group to get more things done, especially with developers that are still coming into our community and have a long ways to go. So we're having those conversations as well as with the LRT and Metrolinx. We truly believe that gentrification only happens when the community is not involved. It's revitalization when the community is involved. So with our involvement, we have to be active with our involvement, and we have to push forward our demands so that we are recognized, our place is recognized, and our stance is recognized so that we could actually make the changes that our community wants and needs.